There is something that is just so deeply unsettling about forests at night, but it's not because we just know there's something lurking out there. It's actually because we don't know what's lurking out there. See, during the day, forests are like these beautiful, peaceful, tranquil places, but at night, their energy shifts into something completely different. Every tree starts to feel judgmental and slightly hostile, like it's hiding at least one secret government experiment. Picture it. You're standing there in this dark forest all alone. You can barely see except for moonlight coming between the branches, and you hear a twig snap behind you. You're not thinking logically. Your brain does not immediately just think it's a squirrel. You go absolutely crazy and think, this is it. I'm about to become a documentary. Honestly, though, that's an ancient reaction built into us because here's the thing about us as humans. We're not actually designed to enjoy things like darkness and isolation or unexplained noises, which is probably why almost every culture on Earth eventually went on to create folk tales and mythology and campfire stories about things like wild men, giant hairy creatures, mountain monsters, those things that just kind of watch us silently from the tree line while we make terrible survival decisions. And diving into stories like that, it really kind of helps us to realize something that's even bigger and a lot more interesting. See, when it comes down to it, it's not even really about the monsters. It's about that terrifying moment that we as humans start to realize that nature is still so much bigger and darker and so much less understood than we'd ever like to admit. If you are new here, and I bet you are because I'm pretty new here too, at this channel on the Ninth File, I love to dive into just some weird stuff like cryptids, conspiracies, weird and dark history, unsolved mysteries, true crime, cults, all that kind of stuff. Topics that make people go, huh, that is deeply weird and mildly concerning. So if that sounds like you're kind of weird, we should totally be friends and you should hit the subscribe button because around here, I love to dive into that stuff and I'm going to do it with a lot of research, sarcasm, some science, a little bit of dark humor, and some moderately acceptable production quality. Also, while you're hitting that subscribe button, I want you to tell me this, okay? If you're alone in the woods and you hear something that sounds pretty massive breathing right outside of your tent, what would scare you more if it was Bigfoot or discovering that it's another human? For me, honestly, humans have a much worse track record. All right, grab your flashlight, preferably like a good one, not the horror movie ones they use and they buy them at the guaranteed to die section of Walmart, because tonight we are heading into those dark and creepy woods. Before we get any further, we've got to discuss this giant hairy problem that's wandering through North American folklore like it forgot to pay taxes. Bigfoot, also known as Sasquatch, the wild man, that thing my uncle saw while camping in 1987, and of course, the undisputed heavyweight champion of blurry photography. I mean, seriously, people have managed to photograph some amazingly cool things in the world, like black holes or deep sea squid, the surface of Mars, but Bigfoot still looks like security footage from a haunted gas station. I gotta say though, that level of stealth is just honestly impressive. So what exactly is Bigfoot supposed to be? Well, this one's kind of a little tricky because the descriptions actually vary pretty wildly, which for me is a bit of a red flag. Depending on who you ask, Bigfoot is anywhere between 7 to 10 feet tall. He is covered in this thick, bushy, dark hair, but also massively muscular. And most of this video footage and the pictures I see are taken from a distance, so it kind of seems like he's going to have to be one or the other, because if he's super hairy, you're not really going to be able to tell how muscular he is from a distance. But anyway, a lot of people describe him as ape-like, but also other people say he's very human. Interesting. This one's new to me though, okay? Glowing eyes. I've never heard that before until I started diving into this research. That one was completely new to me. The only thing I can think of is like when you shine a flashlight at an animal, and it only works on animals, it does not work on humans. But in the dark, if you shine a flashlight, it makes their eyes reflect the light and appear to be glowing. So maybe that's what people are seeing, which would definitely put Bigfoot in the animal category because again, that only works on animals, not human. All right. Next thing is some people say he's silent, while other people have a lot of different noises that they say Bigfoot makes, anywhere from like knocking to growling, grunting, howling, moaning, lots of different sounds out there. And then the last one is impossibly fast, which is interesting because I'm picturing this giant, hairy, muscular gorilla thing that walks like a normal guy. His eyes are glowing like laser beams or something, and he is just trudging through the jungle at like 5,000 miles an hour while making no noise. As you can see, none of that really seems to fit together for me, so I have questions at this point. I feel like we're basically describing some kind of homeless gorilla ninja with wilderness survival skills. But somehow, this same creature leaves absolutely no biological evidence, avoids every wildlife camera in existence, and apparently only reveals itself to hunters, exhausted hikers, or guys named Rick holding a flashlight from Walmart. Now, speaking of hikers and hunters, it's really important to mention the most famous piece of Bigfoot evidence in North America, and that is the Patterson-Gimlin footage. And this one is super famous. It dates all the way back to 1967 at Bluff Creek. So I got to tell you, like, it's super grainy, super blurry. It's one of those pieces where either you believe it or you don't, and there are camps for both sides of that. So we've got these two dudes, Robert Patterson and Bob Gimlin, and they claim that they encountered this massive hairy creature while they're out in the woods. And of course, as luck would have it, they had their video camera with them and they filmed it. And what followed happened to be one of the most debated pieces of video footage in internet history. Believers say that the gait of this creature is far too natural, the proportions are just far too strange, and the muscle movement is so realistic, meaning that it's not any known creature. Bigfoot exists, it seems real. But the skeptics still say, hey, that is absolutely a dude in a suit. And honestly, both sides have enough points to keep this argument alive for basically ever, which is why Bigfoot survives beautifully on a cultural level. Not because there's like overwhelming evidence, but just because the evidence that we do have is just weird enough to keep the conversation alive. And this is just one of many blurry photographs and videos that make the rounds on social media. There are literally hundreds, maybe even thousands more. Before we even had smartphone cameras in our pockets, or even those bulky video recorders of yesteryear, it is important to note, though, Bigfoot was still a part of the conversation. He didn't come along with technology. He dates all the way back to Native American folklore, and this is where I feel like it gets way deeper than just like hairy forest monkey. It becomes genuinely fascinating because once you start digging into like the indigenous folklore across North America, you start to notice something that I find incredibly interesting. These stories are absolutely not random. We have different tribes and different cultures, and they were separated by things like huge amounts of distance. They spoke different languages. The living environments were completely different. They had traditions that were completely separate from each other, but they still shared these remarkably similar themes in their stories involving things like wild humanoids and giant beings. But it's not just Bigfoot, there's other common themes too. So if you like this as much as I think this topic is cool, I do want to note that there are all kinds of tales from all around the world in different, mythologies and stuff that discuss things like dangerous wilderness spirits and giants and floods and ancient beings just connected to nature itself. And to me, that raises one of the most interesting questions. Why do so many ancient cultures keep describing such similar ideas? Because it's not, in this particular case, just a big hairy creature. The overlap appears from mythologies all around the world when it comes to these giant forest cryptids, okay? And honestly, for me, that's where this conversation starts getting super exciting, both psychologically and anthropologically. So here's something I think is super cool. That wild man archetype, it exists absolutely everywhere. And that's important because North America was not the only place with stories about Bigfoot type creatures. You saw similar themes in Europe, Asia, Siberia, the Himalayas, even parts of the Middle East. Almost every culture developed some version of that thing beyond civilization, which tells us something important right away. Humans everywhere seem to instinctively create mythology around wilderness, isolation, and the human-like beings existing out of normal society. And honestly, that kind of makes sense because for most of human history, wilderness was absolutely terrifying. Modern people hear the word forest and they think hiking and camping, trail mix, overpriced equipment, but ancient humans heard the word forest and they thought there is approximately 40 ways to die in there before sunset. Now, once we start discussing how multiple cultures and mythologies had references to Bigfoot type creatures, the internet hears this and immediately screams, "Ancient global Bigfoot empire confirmed." But hey, relax, History Channel. It may not mean that at all, but anthropologically, it does mean something because these reoccurring myths often point to something like a shared human experience, common environmental fears, or even real events that were interpreted through storytelling traditions, which modern internet culture tends to kind of bulldoze over right away and claim that it just means, bro, they all saw Sasquatch. But hey, slow down, Chad. That's not quite how anthropology works. Let's talk about names, because what's really in a name? Apparently a lot. The word Sasquatch, which is most commonly used in the northern half of North America to refer to this particular giant, hairy, forest human-like creature, it actually comes from the Halkomelem language that the Stateless people in the Pacific Northwest used, and the original word was Sasquatch, and roughly it just kind of referred to like a wild or hairy creature. But even there, the interpretation wasn't necessarily undiscovered ape species. See, in many traditions, those beings were typically like a spiritual thing, a symbolic thing, or just cautionary tales that were tied to the dangers of wilderness itself, which makes perfect sense because, and I really cannot stress this enough, okay? Forests were not recreational spaces back then. They were survival environments. Then we have the settlers, and they came along. The Native Americans were already established in North America, and the settlers came in, and that's where the frontier took these indigenous folklore tales of spiritual wilderness beings into this full-blown frontier nightmare fuel. Because once European settlers pushed deeper and deeper into North America, they entered environments that were absolutely unlike anything they had ever experienced before. And I really need modern people to understand what that meant psychologically. See, unlike us, these settlers were not arriving with GPS or maps. They didn't watch wildlife documentaries to know what they were heading into, and they didn't have camping tutorials narrated by a guy named Trevor. These people were entering endless forests, mountain ranges, fog-covered valleys, and wilderness that was so massive it genuinely made human beings feel insignificant. And they had almost zero understanding of the local wildlife behavior, not to mention the strained relationships with a lot of Native American tribes that often led to violence, meaning these settlers were probably beyond stress. And that means every unexplained sound was not just a sound. It became, there's a demon man in the trees. Fair though, right? Because if you dropped me into 1700s Appalachia with no flashlight, no GPS, and something screaming in the woods at night, I would also immediately assume, well, that forest is haunted by giant ape murderers. All right, so imagine living in the 1700s in Appalachia or some other deep frontier territory. Now, back in those days, you had no electricity, no roads, no reliable form of communication, and at night, the woods were pitch black, not suburban dark. I'm talking real dark, the kind of darkness where every sound starts to feel targeted and every branch snap feels personal, and your brain, it starts inventing demons before dinner. The settlers were constantly hearing these things, these strange animal noises, screams from mountain lions, bears moving through the brush, wolves, unfamiliar wildlife behavior, and none of these things were like anything they had ever encountered before. See, most of those settlers at the time were arriving from places like the UK, where they didn't have giant bears. So imagine wandering into this endlessly dark forest and encountering a giant black bear standing upright, lit only by the moonlight. Without modern biological understanding, many people would interpret the sights and sounds of that time through folklore, superstition, religion, and of course, fear, which means that unidentified thing in the woods would quickly become wild mountain creature. And as gossip and rumors do, they started spreading like wildfire. As the settlers expanded westward and deeper into the mountainous regions, the stories started circulating about these giant hairy men, these mountain wild men, and these ape-like creatures, these strange humanoid-looking things that live deep within the forest. Now, To be clear, these were rumors. They were folklore, campfire tales, frontier tales. There is no verified evidence that these things existed. Nobody was out there conducting official mountain ape census operations, but the stories spread anyway because frontier culture was built on oral storytelling and exaggeration, survival fear, and people trying to explain unfamiliar experiences. And honestly, humans love turning uncertainty into monsters, especially bored humans isolated in the woods. Now, this part matters a lot psychologically. It's called the campfire story effect. And the thing is, once one strange story enters a community, every future unexplained event starts getting filtered through that story. So imagine this. One hunter claims, "I saw this giant hairy thing standing near the ridge." Now, suddenly, every strange track, every howl, every shadow, every missing livestock incident, it becomes connected to the mountain wild man. And that's how folklore snowballs. Human beings are basically just biological rumor amplifiers, especially in isolated communities where storytelling was entertainment. There was no Netflix back then. Your entertainment literally was terrifying mountain ape stories. Now, here is where I think things started to get really interesting because there were these stories of settlers, and sometimes they would go out with Native American tribes hunting ape creatures. Now, I want to stress that there is absolutely zero evidence to verify these stories. All we have are historical rumors and a couple of journal entries that the settlers made. But what they described was settlers organizing searches and hunts for giant hairy creatures, wild men, or ape-like beings in the mountain. And what's really interesting about that is it scientifically, anyway, has been proven that there were no giant apes ever in North America. So what is it that they were hunting, or what did they think they were hunting? Was it just folklore and rumor, or was there really something out there? These stories especially took hold in areas like Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, and very isolated frontier territories. Again, these are folklore tales, regional rumors. There's no confirmed historical evidence, but the stories absolutely circulated. And honestly, I mean, it does make sense culturally because before the settlers even came to North America, they already had myths and tales about wild men and giants, mountain hermits, and dangerous human-like creatures. So once a few stories started to spread, frontier paranoia just kind of did the rest. And remember, many of these settlers had never seen North American wildlife before. Picture things like a bear, even a moose. And if you don't know, and I've never encountered one face to face, but from what I understand, they can actually be pretty aggressive and quite dangerous. So just imagine your first time encountering these gigantic creatures in a forest that's dimly lit. It would be terrifying. Now, before we go any further, I want to take a minute to give a shout out to Bigfoot's distant snow cousin, the Yeti, because the Yeti is probably just as famous as Bigfoot is. It is the Himalayas original, absolutely not. Now, before he became what he is now, which is like documentaries narrated by guys whispering dramatically into snowstorms, History Channel specials, and blurry footprints that launched 1,000 conspiracy threads, the legend of the Yeti existed for a long time in Himalayan folklore. And to me, the real history about the Yeti is way more interesting than just saying snowy Bigfoot, because unlike a lot of modern cryptids, the Yeti legend came from one of the harshest environments on Earth, the Himalayas. And the Himalayas, they're not just mountains. They are freezing, they're isolated, they are actively trying to kill you at all times, but even more importantly, in the area, they are spiritually significant. Humans didn't just walk to those mountains thinking, what a lovely hiking opportunity. They walked near them, saw them, and thought to themselves, the gods absolutely live here and they are pissed. So, where did the name Yeti come from? Interestingly, the word Yeti probably came from Tibetan and Sherpa language roots that were connected to words like wild man, rocky place bear, or man-like creature, but the exact linguistic origin is pretty widely debated because multiple Himalayan cultures had different names and different interpretations, and even different stories about similar creatures. Which again is important because the Yeti was not just this one single clearly defined creature. It was more like a collection of mountain folklore involving mysterious beings living beyond human civilization. But then the Western explorers showed up and basically just went, yeah, dude, snowy Bigfoot. Here's a piece of the story that I absolutely love. How did we go from the traditional name Yeti into abominable snowman? Okay, it's absolutely hilarious. Okay, I didn't know this prior to researching for this video, but it did give me quite a good laugh. The phrase abominable snowman was not some ancient sacred title. It actually came from a mistranslation by a Western journalist in the 1920s after British explorers reported seeing these really large footprints near Mount Everest. A local term that describes something closer to wild man or man-bear creature accidentally got mistranslated into abominable snowman, which really sounds a lot less like some kind of ancient cryptid and more like a rejected Scooby-Doo villain. But the name exploded globally because humans hear giant mysterious snow creature and they immediately lose all emotional stability. Now, when it came to Himalayan folklore, these beings were not always just viewed as being animals. They were more like spiritual entities, protectors of sacred areas, dangerous wilderness beings, omens, or just simply symbols of nature's power. And that distinction is super important because modern cryptid culture really does try to treat folklore like some kind of historical wildlife report, but mythology is usually a lot more symbolic and layered than just that. The mountains themselves, they were considered sacred and dangerous, so any stories about mysterious beings that lived there reflected the fear, spirituality, survival, and just humanity's relationship with nature. Because if you lived near giant frozen mountains where avalanches would regularly bury people, climbers would vanish, storms would appear out of nowhere, and bodies would lay frozen in place for decades, you too would probably invent mountain creatures. And honestly, the Himalayas barely need cryptids. The environment itself just already feels supernatural. But let's be real for a second, because those Himalayan mountains, they are horrifying. We've all heard tales from Mount Everest, okay? You've got avalanches, crevasses, blizzards, altitude sickness, low oxygen, freezing temperatures, isolation, and mountain cliffs that look personally offended by your existence. Humans disappear and die there constantly. People hallucinate there. Bodies remain frozen in place for decades upon decades. Storms erase evidence from things that are happening almost immediately. This is not an environment where you're calmly sitting there thinking to yourself, I should rationally evaluate the situation. This is the type of place where your brain just starts saying there is definitely an ancient mountain demon nearby. So we've got two different regions, North America and the Himalayas, and these areas are vastly different when it comes to their culture and their geography. So we really do have to ask, what is it that people are actually seeing out there for them to have such similar tales? That's really what everybody wants to know. And scientifically, well, there's a couple of likely possibilities. So let's dive into the scientific buzzkill section. Now, here's the thing. The most likely number one answer is bears. A massive percentage of both Bigfoot and Yeti sightings can really be explained by bears standing upright or partially obscured by trees or weather or viewed at a distance, or bears just moving in low light conditions. And when it comes to North America, black bears specifically are surprisingly tall upright. They are weirdly human looking from far away, and they walk bipedally for short distances, which really does kind of check off all those Bigfoot boxes. So somewhere out there, there is a bear that's probably accidentally responsible for like 60 documentaries, 14 podcasts, and 3 grown men buying thermal imaging equipment. Poor bear, he has no idea. He's innocent. He's just trying to live his bear life. But let's start with the obvious thing here. Bears, okay, they're terrifying first off. I mean, have you ever watched some of those nature videos where they just kind of encounter things and start destroying them? Bears are frightening. They are also enormous and from a distance, again, surprisingly human looking. And that whole standing upright thing, like, I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of creepy. And when you add things in like weather and low light, all of those things together, it just makes you terrified. And when you become terrified, you stop thinking clearly. So here in North America, we don't really have like a whole ton of verified evidence of Bigfoot aside from like the worst quality videos known to man. I mean, there's been some footprints and some hair samples, but the Yeti really has a whole different thing going on. But once again, I'm going to tell you, those poor bears, they are the most overworked explanation in cryptid history. I mean, they are basically carrying the entire cryptid genre on their backs, because when it comes to the Himalayas, it's probably the bears there as well. Scientists have had a ton of things to work with, where people have found footprints and hair, DNA, all kinds of things. And the results repeatedly pointed towards known animals, and those animals were Himalayan brown bears, Tibetan blue bears, and Asiatic black bears, which is far less exciting than ancient snow ape lurking in forbidden mountains, but biologically it sure does make a lot more sense. Bears just really fit the Yeti legend so well because, again, under the right conditions, all these bears are huge. And when you see them standing upright in huge snowstorms or fog, the visibility is terrible. Not to mention, you could be suffering from altitude exhaustion and sickness. There's low oxygen, you are literally freezing to death, and your human brain is just not operating at its prime level. So, a large bear standing upright in those conditions, it genuinely appears disturbingly human-like from a distance. So, especially at a brief encounter, and in the Himalayas, pretty much every encounter is going to be brief because that mountain is actively trying to kill you the entire time. One of people's favorite bits of evidence when it comes to the Yeti is also footprints, but here's the thing, okay? Again, we're in the Himalayas and it is quite frozen and snowy there, and snow can be deceptive. So when you start seeing tracks in snow, we got to remember that snow does fun things like melt or stretch, collapse, overlap. It distorts constantly, meaning any ordinary track can genuinely transform into evidence of an ancient mountain cryptid, especially giant bear tracks that start to overlap each other and melt together. I mean, at that point, nature is basically editing the evidence like enhanced dramatic effect. And here's where psychology starts to jump into this chat again, because the human brain makes all of this so much worse, okay? We're seeing all kinds of things out there, and we're just not designed for accuracy under stress. We're designed for survival, meaning when you're in low light in a dense forest, you're already scared, you're already nervous, so your brain is just trying to fill in missing information. Science actually calls this pattern completion under uncertainty, but me personally, I call it your brain gaslighting you for survival purposes, because your brain would really rather falsely identify a shadow as being a threat than fail to identify a real threat. Evolution just basically said you're better off paranoid than dead, which means when you see strange movements, it becomes a figure, and that figure suddenly becomes human-like, and that human-like figure becomes the Yeti, and that happens so fast in like 3 seconds. And then we got to take into account the environment, because some of these areas have really created the legends themselves. That's why the bear explanation doesn't completely kill the mystery emotionally, because places like the Himalayas just feel supernatural. They're so isolated, they're silent, they're full of storms and mystery. The altitude does things to your brain. I mean, it just creates the perfect psychological condition for mythology. Forests are also psychologically horrifying because humans just did not evolve to feel comfortable in dense darkness, unfamiliar terrain, or environments where every sound feels personal. A twig snapping in your backyard at your house while you're enjoying a cup of coffee, it probably feels pretty normal, but that same twig snapping in the woods at 2 a.m. behind you, well, your soul just leaves your body. So if science says it was probably a bear, the experience still feels kind of otherworldly to the people who live through it. And honestly, seeing a massive bear emerge through a Himalayan snowstorm at dusk probably would feel like encountering some kind of mountain demon. All right, I want to be fair here, and I want to discuss both sides of this. So let's talk about why the bear theory doesn't fully satisfy everyone, because some sightings just don't match normal bear behavior cleanly. Witnesses sometimes describe things like the shoulders being wider than expected, the bipedal walking being way too smooth to be a bear, the strides being unusually long, the arms being way too long, and movement patterns that are just unlike any known animals. And here's what makes that super frustrating, because a lot of these eyewitnesses are hunters, park rangers, military personnel. They're outdoorsmen that are familiar with wildlife, meaning they're not just random tourists screaming at tree stumps. They're experienced people saying, look, dude, I know what a bear looks like, and that ain't it. Now, scientifically, we do have to remember that eyewitness testimony alone is weak evidence, because the human memory is extremely unreliable under stress. But Psychologically, that really does make the stories a lot harder to just dismiss. And now we're going to come to what is probably the most likely and overlooked theory of all. What are people seeing out there? People. Yeah, just people. I know it's not super exciting, but here's the thing. Ancient North America absolutely did have isolated individuals, wandering tribes, hostile encounters between groups of people, people living outside of normal social structures, and humans surviving deep in wilderness areas. So some stories about wild men or forest people or hairy beings, yeah, they could have originated from misunderstood human encounters, hostile strangers, or just isolated individuals living differently from surrounding groups. Which, I gotta say, could actually be creepier than Bigfoot, because history has repeatedly proven that humans are usually the most dangerous thing in the forest. And here's the most important thing that people often miss, okay? Modern internet culture treats indigenous folklore like it's some kind of ancient eyewitness report, but mythology doesn't work that way. Mythology is stories that blend together spirituality, symbolism, morality, survival lessons, and cultural identity. So trying to force them into the mold as proof of cryptids completely misses the point. That's kind of like reading Greek mythology and going, perfect, we have scientifically confirmed that Zeus was running airstrikes from Mount Olympus. Okay, now let's dive into another theory here. And this one, I gotta say, I had questions. I think it's interesting. Could something unknown actually exist? Okay, after all of that skepticism, we've got to talk about the real reason that Bigfoot theories refuse to die in the first place. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Science doesn't know everything that's living on Earth. I mean, not even remotely, which is honestly insane when you think that we as humans have invented artificial intelligence, nuclear submarines, and social media apps entirely dedicated to people dancing near kitchen counters. But we still regularly discover animals chilling out somewhere going, oh, hey, you just noticed me? Nature is still hiding things, like constantly. And I'm not just talking about microscopic stuff either. Scientists are still regularly discovering mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, deep sea organisms, and creatures that look like they were designed during some kind of fever dream. It happens every single year, especially in places like dense jungles or cave systems, remote mountains, and deep oceans, which, okay, give me a minute here, because by the way, oceans are basically like Earth's unfinished basement full of nightmare creatures. Every single time one of those scientists explores deeper and deeper underwater, they just come back with something that just looks like absolutely not. But I do think that that is also important to this conversation, because when cryptid believers hear phrases like new species discovered, they immediately start screaming, see, Bigfoot's out there. Okay, I'll be fair. I get why you make that leap. It's an easy leap to make. Let me throw in another point here, because then there's those extinct animals, except not really, okay? Because nature occasionally pulls like the funniest move imaginable, where scientists declare something to be extinct and then decades later, that species goes, nope. These are actually called Lazarus species, and I think that is so freaking cool. It sounds less like biology and more like some kind of progressive rock band from the 70s, but it's a really cool thing where animals that were believed to have gone extinct have occasionally been rediscovered after decades or sometimes even centuries without a single confirmed sighting. Scientists have discovered frogs, fish, birds, reptiles, and small mammals, basically proving that sometimes nature hides things surprisingly well. And every single time this happens, the Bigfoot enthusiasts collectively rise from the dead like my time has come. But here is where science hits the brakes pretty darn hard on both the undiscovered species and the Lazarus species, because unfortunately for Team Sasquatch, there is a pretty big difference between rare frog rediscovered in remote jungle and 9-foot tall forest human-like creature avoiding every camera in North America. This is not a tiny leap. This is like a pole vault directly into cryptid Olympics territory. Because here's the thing, large mammals, they leave some evidence, and a lot of it. So if they were actually living somewhere, especially in North America where people are literally everywhere, we would have found bones, DNA, bodies, scat, hair, ecological impact, food source evidence, and the biggest thing of all, there would have to be a breeding population, meaning there's a number of these creatures existing out there. But so far, nothing, just crickets. And that's the same giant problem that Bigfoot theories continue to run into again and again and again, like a raccoon hitting a glass door. But here's the thing, even with all of that skepticism, the possibility still kind of lingers in people's minds because forests are huge and mountains are remote, and humans are painfully aware that we have not explored every single inch of this planet equally, especially not deep wilderness or isolated terrain or regions humans rarely enter. And psychologically, we just want that mystery to survive. Modern life has explained almost everything now with GPS and satellites, drones, and Google Earth. We mapped the world so aggressively that humans started becoming emotionally nostalgic for uncertainty. Bigfoot survives partly just because people want there to still be something unknown out there, something beyond complete explanation, something we just can't quite pin down yet. All right. Let's dive into the ancient hominid theory. Like, what if Bigfoot is not an ape, but more of a distant cousin? We're entering a section here where anthropology and conspiracy theories have accidentally made eye contact across the room, and it got awkward because this is a theory that just refuses to die. But I gotta tell you, it's pretty cool. It's fun. I enjoyed researching it. What if Bigfoot is not a giant ape at all? What if it's something weirder? Something that's closer to us? Now, before I go any further, I just want to say this very clearly for the algorithm, the scientist, and that guy already typing in all caps. There is zero scientific evidence proving Bigfoot exists as a surviving hominid species. This is speculative, but it is also one of the most fascinating Bigfoot theories ever created because unlike interdimensional forest wizard, this one at least starts with actual anthropology. See, humans used to share the earth with other human species, and that's kind of the part that people forget a lot. Modern humans were not always alone. For huge stretches of history, Earth looked less like humanity and more like a very confusing extended family reunion. There were Neanderthals, Denisovians, Homo erectus, and several other ancient hominid species, meaning at one point in history, if you were to walk into the woods, there genuinely could have been another type of human out there. And I gotta tell you, that is a deeply unsettling thought to have. Now, here's the thing about some of these ancient human species. Let's talk about the Neanderthal. When people start imagining Neanderthals, they picture like a large caveman screaming at a mammoth. But scientifically, Neanderthals were actually intelligent. They were highly adaptable, physically powerful, capable of tool use. They were quite social, and they were incredibly resilient in brutal climates. These were not primitive idiots. They were humans with culture, survival skills, hunting strategies, and get this, enough intelligence to survive Ice Age Europe, something most of us today could not do. Also, modern humans literally interbred with them. That means part of humanity looked at Neanderthals and went, yeah, honestly, close enough, which really changes how people think about ancient humans. So could something like that have survived? And this is where the Bigfoot theory kind of mutates. There are theorists out there who suggest, what if there's this isolated branch of ancient hominids that survived in remote wilderness areas? They're not building cities, they're not secretly running society. They're just kind of surviving quietly in isolated regions where humans rarely explore. And honestly, as a concept, that is actually way creepier than forest gorilla because suddenly Bigfoot becomes something that is almost human. And humans are always scarier than monsters. Monsters might eat you, but as humans, we invented nuclear weapons and HOA regulations. Okay, let's dive into the Gigantopithecus theory. And before I go any further, just want to warn you, every time I say that, it's going to sound like I'm struggling because for whatever reason, my mouth does not like saying the word Gigantopithecus. Every time I say it, it's like the hardest tongue twister. So if I mess it up, I am so sorry. I am doing my very best. But this is the internet's favorite candidate when it comes to like ancient things that could be Bigfoot. A lot of people are connecting Bigfoot to Gigantopithecus, and that's an actual extinct giant ape species that lived in Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it was real. This thing was also enormous. I mean, we're talking 9 to 10 feet tall. It was massively built. It was likely one of the largest primates to ever exist, which immediately made cryptid enthusiasts scream, that has to be Bigfoot. And scientifically, there are some very large problems with this theory, okay? So first off, Gigantopithecus was probably more of an orangutan than human-like. Secondly, there is zero evidence that it ever existed in North America. And then third, scientists believe that it actually likely moved as a quadruped instead of like bipedally, meaning that it was on all fours, not walking upright on two legs. But it's important to point out once again, if a breeding population survived in modern times for this creature, we would still have fossils, bones, DNA, or ecological evidence by now. And we don't. So scientifically, this theory, while fun, does not hold up at all. It has absolutely fueled the modern Bigfoot imagination because suddenly there's this real giant ape in Earth's history. And once people hear that, their brains immediately say, okay, but what if one still exists? And as fun as it is to think about, there's just no evidence for it. All right, so here's the thing. Bigfoot and Yeti, they feel almost human, and there is another reason the ancient hominid theory survives. Many witnesses describe Bigfoot as moving too smoothly to be an animal, walking with human-like posture, appearing intelligent, watching people, avoiding detection strategically. Again, none of this really proves anything scientifically because human perception is wildly unreliable under stress, but psychologically, those descriptions trigger something very primal in us because humans evolved to recognize things that are shaped like humans. And when something looks almost human but wrong, our brains react hard. That is why we find things like mannequins creepy, uncanny AI faces are creepy, and hairy humanoids silently watching from forests immediately become nightmare fuel. It's the uncanny valley wearing hiking boots. Okay, bonus theory. What if Bigfoot is just people? Okay, we are entering the section of the internet where sleep deprivation and conspiracy theories just started collaborating creatively because eventually someone looked at Bigfoot sightings and wilderness disappearances and strange wild man tales in remote national parks and said, okay, but what if they aren't cryptids at all? What if they're just feral humans? Before I go further, I gotta throw out a warning again. This theory has zero evidence supporting it. None. No verified hidden populations, no secret mountain tribes, no underground forest civilization avoiding taxes in Yosemite. It is pure speculation and internet folklore. But honestly, it is fascinating in a deeply cursed way. The story basically goes like this. Some people believe that there could be isolated human populations hidden deep in wilderness areas living completely outside of civilizations, and they're surviving for generations just in like forests or mountains. And according to the theory, people occasionally glimpse these individuals briefly and mistake them for Bigfoot. Now, immediately your rational brain should be screaming, that makes absolutely no sense. And you would be correct because it doesn't. But let's continue because this rabbit hole gets weird. Okay, so why are people connecting this conspiracy about feral humans to national parks? Well, the conspiracy itself usually centers around massive wildlife areas, and those would be places like Yosemite National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, remote forests, mountain ranges, areas where people disappear or report strange encounters. I mean, think about it, a lot of these places are so vast and not as touched by humans, so it's easy to get lost or hide things there. The logic goes, because these places are so huge or remote and difficult to search, what if they're hiding groups and letting them live there undetected? And this is where conspiracy theory brain just fully activates, because once humans realize wilderness is remote, people vanish there, and visibility is terrible, the imagination immediately starts building secret forest societies. Human beings cannot leave uncertainty alone for even 5 minutes. But why does this theory feel so much creepier than just thinking Bigfoot's some random creature? Honestly, it bothers people more than thinking it's a giant ape monster. And I think it's because a giant cryptid is pure fantasy, but feral humans, it feels disturbingly possible. not necessarily scientifically, but more emotionally, because as humans, we already know that isolated people exist and humans can survive in some really brutal conditions. And civilization has historically lost track of groups of people before. So the theory creates this horrifying image of something human, but no longer socially human, which immediately activates some kind of primal fear center in your brain, because humans are really uncomfortable with things that look almost human but behave unpredictably. Again, this is why mannequins are so darn creepy. And then we have the wild man connection, okay? This theory also tries to explain historical stories about wild men and forest people and mountain hermits, even hairy human-like creatures. Basically, it says maybe people weren't seeing monsters, they're just seeing isolated humans. And there absolutely were isolated individuals of hermits, outcasts, hostile encounters in the wilderness, people just living outside of normal places. But there is no evidence that there's like this huge hidden breeding population of these feral humans secretly living in national parks, especially not modern national parks in North America, which are incidentally full of tourists, drones, hikers, wildlife cameras, and influencers filming themselves falling into rivers for content. At some point, somebody would have accidentally live streamed Bigfoot stealing trail mix. Then the theory gets a little bit weirder because eventually the conspiracy mutated into, and the government knows about it. Because of course it does. According to the internet, the government is simultaneously hiding aliens, hiding Bigfoot, controlling the weather, monitoring cryptids, and still somehow unable to fix a pothole. But in this theory, national parks become giant cover-up zones where authorities supposedly conceal disappearances, suppress evidence, or hide encounters with these wild people. But there's a scientific problem, and it's a big one, okay? This is why this theory and so many others fall apart scientifically, because once again, we run into the issue where a hidden human population, like any other hidden population, they would have left evidence. If it were humans, it would have been evidence of camps, waste, tools, fires, DNA, remains, ecological impact. There would be far more consistent sightings, because here's the thing, humans are messy. We leave evidence everywhere. I mean, civilization at this point can barely stop people from posting crimes on Facebook Live, okay? The idea that an entire hidden population is silently surviving undetected in modern North America is just unrealistic. Again, there's no evidence for this, but here's the fun thing. People connect it to the missing 411 cases because some of those disappearances feel eerie and unresolved. And once fear enters the equation, humans just kind of start assigning hidden intent to randomness. Okay, so maybe you're wondering, maybe you already know what the missing 411 is. This is where David Paulides, who is an ex-cop, enters this conversation. See, Paulides compiled this group of wilderness disappearances into something he called the missing 411. What it does is basically emphasize patterns that involve national parks, children, experienced outdoorsmen, unusual recovery locations, and strange circumstances surrounding all these different disappearances. And he just says, hey, these are weird. Now, to be fair, some of these cases are genuinely creepy, okay? And they just are mysterious and unexplainable. But here's the important part that a lot of people skip. Both researchers and search and rescue professionals have repeatedly spoken out and criticized Paulides for exaggerating details, omitting context, ignoring medical conditions, and presenting cases as being unexplained when there actually were explanations, meaning the storytelling is often stranger than the actual case and evidence itself, which is kind of the internet's entire business model at this point. One of the creepiest things in the missing 411 is children found in impossible places. And this is definitely one that freaks people out and it makes you ask a lot of questions. And these are cases where children vanish and then later turn up in locations that just seem impossibly far away or difficult to access, or they've already been searched numerous times and now suddenly the kids are there. Cryptid culture loves these stories though, because they create that feeling that something has moved the children. A good case example is the bear took care of me theory, and there's more than one case that is documented where children have later described things like a bear helping them, or a bear-like creature leading them through the woods, a hairy figure that is watching them, or a strange dreamlike encounter during survival situations. But here's the thing, scientifically, children under extreme stress tend to become disoriented, they enter into survival states, they experience fragmented memory, and they oftentimes confuse dreams, hallucinations, and reality. Under that kind of stress, memory gets really weird really fast, and you've got a lot of stressful things happening like hypothermia, dehydration, fear, exhaustion. But emotionally, those stories just kind of hit in a completely different way because a tiny child surviving in impossible wilderness conditions feels almost supernatural afterwards. And then we have the just downright strange disappearances that kind of keep you up at night. Two good cases in point are the Dennis Martin case and the Dion Kuntz Jr. case. So Dion Martin is a much older case, okay? All the way back in 1969 in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. You've got 6-year-old Dennis Martin, and he disappears during a family camping trip. And this case became absolutely legendary just because of how quickly everything happened. See, Dennis was playing with a group of other children near the camp, and all these kids decided they were going to play this harmless little prank on the adults where they hide in the woods and then they jump out and scare them, like classic kid behavior, right? Tiny future heart attack generators. But the children go in the woods, and when they jump back out, Dennis isn't there. He never returned. He's just gone in mere seconds. So here's why this case terrifies people. Massive searches for this boy began immediately. I mean, we're talking hundreds of searchers, FBI involvement, Green Berets, volunteers, tracking dogs. And yet, nothing definitive was ever found. No clear trail, no body, no explanation. And here's where the Bigfoot theories explode, because a nearby family that was camping in the area claimed that they heard a scream, a strange rustling, and then they saw, and I'm going to quote here, a rough-looking wild man carrying something over his shoulder moving through the woods, which immediately caused cryptid theorists to collectively kick down the door screaming it was Sasquatch. Scientifically, there's no evidence supporting that, but emotionally, you can see why that story spread. Now, what most likely happened? Well, search and rescue experts believe that Dennis likely became disoriented, he was wandering in dangerous terrain, and eventually succumbed to exposure or injury. And unfortunately, here's the thing about dense wilderness. It can hide remains for literal decades, if not indefinitely. Nature is horrifyingly efficient at that, but because the case lacks closure, the imagination kind of filled in the silence, and humans are terrible at leaving silence empty. Next, we have the disappearance of Dion Kuntz Jr., and this one is equally creepy, okay? So we're going back to July of 2015 to a family camping trip in Timber Creek Campground, where 2-year-old Dior goes camping with his parents, his great-grandfather, and a family friend in a remote Idaho campground that is surrounded by dense wilderness, rugged terrain, streams, and a thick forest. Now, immediately, this already sounds like the kind of place where your phone loses signal and your survival instincts start to quietly update their will. According to the family, Dior was playing near the camp while the adults briefly split up to fish, explore nearby areas, and just basically move around camp. And then suddenly they realized that he was gone. Just gone. 1 minute, this toddler is right there at the camp, and the next, everyone is standing in the woods realizing, oh no. And that's the moment every parent's nervous system probably collectively left their body. I know for me, I can only imagine the horror in that moment. So why does this case feel so strange? Well, here's why. This case exploded on the internet. Despite massive searches, cadaver dogs, helicopters, divers, tracking teams, FBI involvement, and years of investigation, there has never been a single confirmed trace of Dior. No verified tracks, no remains, no clothing, nothing definitive. And that's what makes people pretty uncomfortable, because wilderness cases usually leave something, even if the answer is tragic. But here, this just feels like the forest just deleted a human being, which is exactly the kind of mystery the internet turns into conspiracy fuel immediately. But here's where the case got even messier. Over time, investigators began questioning the inconsistencies in the adult stories. Private investigator Philip Klein eventually stated publicly that he firmly believed that Dior likely never left the campground alive, and he suggested that there was some deception that may have occurred within the family narrative. To be clear though, no one has ever been charged or convicted, and the case officially remains unsolved. But the conflicting timeline and changing details did cause huge public speculation. And once the internet smells uncertainty, it immediately starts freebasing theories. But because eventually people online started connecting cases like this and the missing 411 to Bigfoot theories and wilderness wildmen and hidden cave systems and even every cryptid Reddit thread active after midnight, the idea of a child vanishing without evidence in the deep wilderness just feels emotionally impossible, and your brain starts searching desperately for something bigger. But here's the thing, scientifically, there is no evidence linking either Dennis or Dior's disappearance to Bigfoot, cryptids, or any sort of supernatural cause. None. The more grounded theories usually involve things like accidental death, human involvement, or some sort of concealment, which is less cinematic than forest creature abduction, but significantly more likely. So after all of that research, all of that evidence, all of the discussion, all of the history, what's the verdict? Well, here's the thing. See, science has a really big problem with Bigfoot, and here's where science ultimately lands. If Bigfoot or Yeti are real, they would need a real breeding population of large primates or hominids. That means we would find bones, DNA, scat, carcasses, consistent ecological evidence. But we have none of it. That's the giant wall that these theories consistently slam into, because large mammals are really hard to hide biologically, especially in modern ecosystems with trail cameras, satellites, drones, hunters, hikers, and literally millions of smartphones. At this point, raccoons have less photographic documentation in nature than humans do, but somehow Bigfoot still looks like security footage from a cursed parking lot. And that's really the real reason the argument over fact or fiction just never dies, though. Because the leading explanation, the bear theory, is logical, supported by biology, supported by perception science, supported by environmental conditions, but it never perfectly explains every single story emotionally. And as humans, we just hate those unresolved gaps. So people keep circling back to, yeah, but what if? Which is basically the fuel source for cryptids, conspiracy theories, and half the internet after midnight. Now, honestly, I know that I have sounded pretty skeptical through most of this video, and there's a good reason for that, because scientifically, you kind of have to be. But I genuinely want Bigfoot to be real. The idea that somewhere in the remote wilderness there's this undiscovered human-like creature surviving quietly, avoiding humans, and watching hikers struggle with camping equipment from the shadows, that is objectively awesome, and I would watch that documentary immediately. But then my brain does this annoying thing where it keeps asking sciencey questions like, where's the DNA, and where's the bones, and how does a breeding population stay hidden this long, and why does every photo look like it was taken by a haunted potato? That's the wall I keep hitting, not because I hate the idea, but because biology is just really hard for me to argue with. For me, the funniest possible outcome, and really the most logical, is just imagine it after all of this, okay? It was bears the entire time. Imagine humanity spending centuries creating folklore, documentaries, podcasts, thermal drone expeditions, conspiracy theories, and meanwhile, somewhere deep in the woods, there's this poor old black bear standing upright for approximately 4 seconds to scratch its back against a tree. And he's just like, fantastic, now I'm some sort of ancient interdimensional forest entity again. So scientifically speaking, there's just not enough evidence for science to say that Bigfoot or Yeti are actually real. But here's the cool thing about science, right? They haven't shut the door on it. They're still open to discovery. And that's so important because science is not saying it's impossible. They're just saying, bring us proof. And until somebody does, Bigfoot is just going to remain where it always has lived. Not fully in science, not fully in mythology, but in that weird, foggy space where fear, curiosity, folklore, and human imagination all overlap in the middle of the forest. Now, if you enjoyed this episode and you want more deep dives into weird stuff like cryptids, conspiracy, dark history, mysteries, any of that, make sure you subscribe to The Ninth File, because around here I really like to ask important questions like, what if the forest is haunted? But like more scientifically. And trust me, I have plenty more weirdness coming. And before you go, I want to know, what do you think Bigfoot actually is? An undiscovered species, some sort of ancient hominid, a feral human, complete myth, or just the most overworked bear population in North America? Drop your theory in the comments, because honestly, some of the wildest cryptid lore on the internet comes from comment sections at 1 a.m., and that's really exactly the kind of terrible decision making that I support.